IES Abroad Alumni Engagements virtual event series. My name is Gregory Hess. I'm the president and CEO of IES Abroad. I have the pleasure of introducing you to Ron Kaufman, who is joining us tonight, actually morning to him, from Singapore. Ron is an alum of our IES London program. He's a best-selling author and the founder of Uplifting Service, an international consulting company which enables organizations to achieve exceptional service cultures and improve performance. Tonight, Ron will share experiences from his time abroad in London, his international career, as well as his longtime passions for ultimate frisbee and environmental causes. To all in attendance, please be sure to share your questions via the Q&A option in your Zoom menu. Ron will be happy to answer questions at the event end. So let me just warmly and generously thank you, Ron, for joining us today, for your time, and just give you the most generous welcome that we can. And let's just start off with some Q&A. At IES Abroad, we think that study abroad changes life, but tell us, how did study abroad influence your life?
Gregory, I would say honestly that study abroad created my life. I mean, there I was, I'd finished 2 semesters at Brown University. Honestly, I was bored with just staying on the same campus. I was a bit of a scoundrel. I knew how to climb up on the roof of every building on the campus. I needed something more. And I found out about IES in London, which made good use of faculty from the School of Economics and Political Science and others, and dove in. And I still remember, Greg, arriving in London and sitting in a black cab on the way to the Lancaster YMCA, which is where we all stayed, and realizing that the accent was different and the money was different and you needed a passport to get there. And it literally just opened up the world to me. And that has been influential in every part of my life. I'm going to show you just a couple of quick pictures here. This one is at the Lancaster Hall Hotel in London, which has become sort of a site of pilgrimage. Every time I'm in London now, I just need to go back to express that feeling of gratitude for how much study abroad changed my life. And when I say changed my life, I mean, this is my passport, or was my passport. And just to give you an idea of how much travel was involved, this is my passport today. I mean, it's just an absolutely extraordinary welcome into a very different life. Of course, during COVID, I haven't been able to travel quite so much, but using screens, the client base and the friend base and the alumni base from IES has also been able to, stay in touch. So IES literally created what happened with the rest of my life.
Wow, that's a great story. I know. I'm sure the Y's cleaned up a little bit since the time you were there. Probably got a refresher too. I was fortunate enough to study abroad in London as well, and do visit, had that little touchstone of a place as well. In my life where I stayed, it once again feels a little more uptown than it did in those days. But I do recognize that passion and that youthful exuberance in your time in London. So you've got a lot of great passion.
Can I ask you a question? Where was your first study abroad?
Oh, so my first study abroad was at the London School of Economics, not far from where you were. Probably a couple years later. And I lived out in near Holland Park, which now is a pretty Tony part of London. Didn't feel it in those days. And certainly the rent reflected that as well. It was not a particularly attractive part to live in, but loved every minute of it.
But for students, it worked.
It absolutely worked. Yes.
And that was the era, I'm sure, for you, like it was for me, where if you wanted to go to the theater and you went down to the West End on the morning of the presentation, any ticket left that hadn't sold was £1, a quid.
It's probably the most theater I've seen in my life. I don't think I've been, and I go to the theater quite a bit, even these days, but I don't think in the time since my year abroad, I have gone to as many places as I did in that year. But you're right, it was one of the great, one of the great gifts that study abroad gave to me. It sounds like you enjoyed it, but it sounds like you kept your days pretty busy. What kinds of things did you get involved in, and how did you stay involved? What of things in addition to your studies? I'm sure. What kept you involved?
Right. I actually had the benefit of already being involved in the sport of ultimate frisbee. So I was in a high school in Connecticut. It was the second high school in the world to have the rules of the game. It was created in New Jersey. We were the next, we were the first inter-high school. And so when our high school class graduated, we all went off to different colleges and started our high school ultimate team, our college ultimate teams. And I started the one at Brown University. And by the time I went to London 2 years later, there was already one guy, a bloke, as they would call it, who was the national director of the Ultimate Frisbee, the Frisbee Association in the UK. And it was the only phone number I had when I landed in London. So I got to the YMCA and how does the phone work? And I put in my coin and I dialed the number, and it turns out the guy lived on the street behind the YMCA. So within 30 minutes of arriving at the hotel, I was in a pub with a new friend, with a sport that actually ended up becoming quite influential in my life, and just had a lot of amazing experiences during that time.
Yeah, well, why don't you unpack some of those experiences for us? I mean, it sounds like it's been just an incredible run for you, for lack of a better term. I'm not sure I have my metaphors right here, but it seems like quite a set of experiences you've had in Ultimate Frisbee. Why don't you unpack some of those for everyone?
Sure, and I'll show you a couple of other shots here. This is, like I said, where I am now, but this is back where I was in high school. A couple of other shots here. This is, like I said, where I am now, but this is back where I was in high school. This was that guy. I wouldn't try to do that with my body today, but I was really pretty passionate about it. When I went to Brown, another thing that I'm quite proud of is I actually had hair, back then. And because I had that impulse to organize, to reach out to other people, to create events, I ended up being given the privilege of serving as the master of ceremonies for the World Frisbee Championships in the Rose Bowl, for the Smithsonian Air and Space Festival in Washington, D.C., and then began creating tournaments and festivals and players associations and family play days and translating the rules of the games into other languages, to the point where on the 50th anniversary of the sport itself, I was inducted into the Hall of Fame for Ultimate Frisbee, but not because I'm a great player, but rather because they said, you know what, you're one of the Johnny Appleseeds. You're one of those people who helped take this amazing sport and bring it out into the world. And of course, today there are millions of people who play it every day. And the Olympic Committee has now recognized it as a legitimate sport. Not yet in the Olympics, but who knows? We'll see.
I'm gonna have to keep posted for that one. That'll keep it pretty interesting. You've been able to translate that passion into other passions, and Ultimate Frisbee, has been a part of your life, but you also were able to translate a lot of the energy that you've got from study abroad and from other passions in your life into kind of professional accomplishments. How did you have just an incredible background in terms of thinking about customer experience, and you've won a number of Global Guru Awards for your ability to develop and cultivate customer experiences worldwide. How did that come about, and how were you able to continually elevate your game?
Yeah, it's I remember when Steve Jobs did the valedictory speech at Stanford. It's on YouTube. Many of us have watched it. And he says, your life makes sense when you look at it going backwards. And it was intriguing because what the Frisbee involvement did, gave me an understanding of adult educational design. Not like an academic, not like a professor, but if you want to get adults involved in learning something new, two really important things came out of the Frisbee world. One is you've got to get them physically involved, not just intellectually involved. That's one of the reasons study abroad is so powerful, because people literally go out in the street and experience the food and the people and the culture and the music. But the other is you got to put them in a good mood. You want someone to learn, it helps if they're in a good mood. And Frisbee taught me that. So there was a moment in time, again, I'll pop up a little shot here for you, when this is Singapore Airlines aircraft tail. And Singapore Airlines is recognized as one of the top airlines in the world. But back in the 1990s, the country itself was not highly recognized for great quality service. This was sort of the one iconic exception. Rather, at that time, coming out of the 70s and 80s, the small country of Singapore was known for low-cost manufacturing. It was in the Asian neighborhood. But all of that was in the process of leaving, and it was going, of course, to China. And all of the back office, the low-cost data entry and call centers, at that time, it was all leaving and it was going to India. So here was this little country that didn't have natural resources, but a lot of people. And not actually that many people who said, we got to figure out how to come up the value chain so that the world still needs us, so that we can still have a healthy economy and a country and a future. And what they realized was the future was going to have more to do with value add through service and through services. And so they decided to create a company that would train the entire adult working population of Singapore. And Singapore Airlines and the government's productivity board created a joint venture. And then they went out looking for consultants. And they found people, the usual consulting firms who could give them the strategy, but not the mechanism for implementation. Because how do you take 800,000 working adults and get them excited about improving their service? Well, somebody knew me and said, have you got any ideas? Oh my goodness, did I have ideas? So they gave me a ticket for 1 week to come to Singapore and said, we want to build a boot camp, a residential boot camp for training about service. And I said, well, what do you mean by the boot camp? And they said, well, we're not sure. Have you got any ideas? And in my mind, obviously what I saw was a Frisbee festival. Not really a Frisbee festival, but let's get adults involved. And I started developing games. And then the games became training. And then the training became workshops, and the workshops produced results. And then the number of clients just got so broad. That's why my passports were so thick, that I ended up becoming somebody who was really talented at helping organizations, B2B, B2C, any industry, boardroom, leader, supervisor, manager, frontline, take their service to a higher level, to the point where we could write white papers about it, and Harvard Business Review would write about it, and then ultimately publishing a best-selling book about how do you actually build a culture that consistently delivers and improves the quality of service that you provide. And every organization is essentially in that situation. Now, of course, during the travel years, it's been a whole lot of fun. And now YouTube is absolutely packed. But to answer your question about, how did I become this? It was by simply being involved in the field and having such a wide range and diversity of experiences.
Yeah. Well, I love your piece about the happy business. I know, in my time as an academic administrator, college president, dean, a couple other things, there was a consultant once told me, if education's not a happy business, it's really no business at all. And the fact is that it's probably true about higher education, but your point is probably that it's probably true about all businesses. You have to find that seam of enthusiasm, and it sounds like you kind of add a dose of physicality to it. Is that something that you've been able to do comprehensively?
Intriguing. After Brown, I moved to California, originally go to law school. And I went through all the application process, but I had a Frisbee mail order business at the time, and the mail order business took off. So I never went to law school, much to my father's chagrin. Of course, he looks at my life today and says, boy, am I glad you didn't go to law school. So this point about, being happy, I give you an example. Singapore is it's really adopted this issue of service. I defined service as taking action to create value for someone else. Service is taking action to create value. So even in the prisons department here, which has been a client of ours, their purpose, their mission is to keep people out of prison. No, wait, you're the prison department. You already got them in prison. But they see themselves as their intent is to actually do everything necessary while you're in prison and after you get out to make sure that you're not somebody who ends up coming back in. And so you could say, can even prisons be happy? I'm not sure happy would be the word, but can it be constructive? Can it be forward-looking, like education? Can it be encouraging of and enabling of a better future?
Well, that's you certainly bring your passions for it, and your example about the prison is one I'm gonna have to reflect on for a while. I don't, it's something obviously we can use more of. Now, you mentioned, the concentration and the emphasis you have on under service and quality, but you do have a lot of, also kind of more broader humanistic passions. What kind of engaging projects are you working on now, in addition to the work you do kind of professionally? What are the things that that you're passionate about, that social causes or otherwise?
Yeah. Being an educator like you and the whole organization at IES are, I have a particular passion for working with younger people, just because there's that opportunity to influence them. And I live, like everybody else, somewhere in the world. I happen to live in Singapore, and I have a habit. I like to go out walking. And in the course of my habit or my hobby of walking, I started realizing that, as wonderful as Singapore is, as clean as Singapore is, there's still litter on the ground. And there's just something about walking past a piece of litter and not picking it up that kind of hurts, because I know then the next person has to see it, and the next and the next. And one day I was walking in the park with my daughter. She was about 4 or 5 years old. And there was an empty Coca-Cola can on the grass. And I saw it, and it wasn't crawling with ants. And so I said to her, "Hold on, honey, just a moment." I left her on the path, and I walked over into the grass, and I picked up the piece of garbage, and I walked along until we got to the garbage can, and I threw it out. And she said, "Daddy, that wasn't yours." And I said to her, "Sweetheart, you're right. It wasn't mine. Like, I didn't drink it. I didn't drop it there. But the moment I saw it, it kind of became mine, like my responsibility to decide whether the next daddy and daughter who might come by in 15, 20, 60 minutes later would have to see the litter on the ground." I said, so, at that moment, I decided, well, that belongs to me. I'm going to be the one who picks it up. And, sometimes the stuff that you pick up, you don't really want to do it with bare hands. So I started walking around with one of those picker-upper sticks, like you take something off the shelf. And then that kind of became a hobby. And then I started walking. I always have a couple of extra plastic bags in my pocket. And because I live in a certain neighborhood, people start to get to know me and go, "That's that guy." In fact, now my daughter's joke is that Singapore is so rich, they have the old white guys picking up the trash, which, I smile when she says it, but it's actually kind of a fun thing. And somebody actually made a little documentary about it. It's up on YouTube called "Leave This Place Better Than You Found It," just about going out into the park and doing so. Well, my wife and I are very avid scuba divers. I met her scuba diving in Australia. She's an Australian, but we go to the Maldives very frequently and we dive. And we have a hobby within the hobby, which is that when we're down under the water, whenever we see a bottle, a can, a fish net, a rope, a piece of fishing line, sometimes it's a diaper, for goodness sake, we're the ones who clean it up. Which means we've started diving now, not only with the knife, which is sort of standard, but we have mesh bags and we've got clips and ropes and, all kinds of things. And once again, a documentary filmmaker found out about it, came and followed us on one of these trips. And actually, if you go to YouTube and you type in my name, Ron Kaufman, trash, you'll find this kind of thing. It's an extraordinary undertaking and a lot of joy for us. Now that became something even further. We went to the local island. There's an island right next to the island where we scuba dive, which is where a lot of the staff live and their children go to school. And islands in the Maldives, local islands as they're called, they're not the cleanest places because people litter. So there's plastic bottles lying around, they're just stuff that shouldn't be on the ground. It should be cleaned up. So we went to the school and we brought slides showing how we as visitors were cleaning up their reef underwater. And we challenged the students to clean up their own island. Of course, they know exactly where the trash is because they either drop it, they see their parents drop it, or they walk by it every day. And in 1 hour, these kids cleaned up 200 pounds of trash from their own island. So the Minister of Tourism found out about it, the Minister of Environment found out, and now it's turning into a whole national program.
Well, cleaning the island is an enormous undertaking. I will say you're probably one of the bravest people I know. I don't think I'd want to put my name in Google and put the word trash next to it and see what people, and then encourage people to follow up on.
You got a good point there, Greg.
That's right. You are a brave man, and maybe that kind of gumption you got from study abroad. I will say though that there's also another tagline that's out there for you about called the Garden Neighbor. Is that something that's related to the Clean the Reef Reef project that you described?
In an interesting way, it is. All of us being human are therefore by definition mortal. And one of the things about being mortal is you age. And at some point, all of us get to pass on, and hopefully with a great sense of appreciation for the amazing time we've had here on Earth. But this issue of aging doesn't tend to be one that people have much top of mind when they're running off to do overseas studies as a college student. And yet inevitably it comes. So I was studying in London in 1976. And my wife and I are now, all four of our parents, by grace of good God, are still alive in their 90s and their 80s and their 70s. And yet, you can see aging happen. So we're kind of wondering, well, where are we going to be? What kind of a world do we want to live in? What kind of people do we want to be as we get older? Are we going to eventually lose certain faculties, as everybody does? But does that mean you lose your vitality? Does that mean you lose your community, your sense of connection? So we just started another interesting project. Singapore is a very, very small country. I mean, it's really just one city. The entire country is 5 times the size of Manhattan Island. That's it. To the north is Malaysia, to the south is Indonesia. We're in the ASEAN neighborhood. And so you can imagine how compressed the land is. Well, we found a small piece of land, and I don't want to tell you what it costs per square foot because it's just scary. But we found that little spot right there that's in the yellow. And we decided, rather than being like everybody else in the neighborhood, we're going to put a wall around the house. We're going to design something that makes the neighborhood feel like we're part of the neighborhood. Where, she comes from Australia, happy hour, barbecue. I come from America, block party, everybody get together in the neighborhood. And we're going to bring that kind of thing to the area. Now, how do you design that? So we reached out to 2 different academic institutions in Singapore. One is the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and the other for younger kids is called Temasek Polytechnic. And both of them have interdisciplinary student projects that have to be done in their final year. So you've got an engineer, and an architect, and an interior designer, and a sustainability person, and a gerontologist, and they have to work together. And we're challenging them to actually come up with the design of what we ultimately will build. And why? Well, because we're not going to look like what we look like in that lower corner. We kind of realize, my wife found this image, one day that may be the case, but we want to also be living with that kind of vitality and joy and connection to other people.
Wow.
And that wasn't on my radar at IES in 1976.
Well, no, I think, mortality is probably not the first thing young people think about when they're studying abroad, but Ron, we appreciate so much your passions and your insights and your enthusiasm and energy. And it seems like you've been able to translate this broadly, into your personal passion, but also your professional passions as well. I want to encourage everybody, if they have questions for Ron, to use the Q&A option there. I see that there's there are a couple in there. Jody, would you like to jump in and help us through some of these questions?
Sure. First of all, thank you both. Hi. Thank you both. It's been so great to be able to listen to you and to learn from you. We have 1 question so far, and everyone, please join in the Q&A. We have a question asking, what would you tell today's students or young graduates about kind of good advice in creating their job or career?
Oh, it's a fantastic question. We have 1 child, she's a daughter, she's 26. And she grew up in Singapore, went to school here, and then studied in the United States, and is now in law school in Texas, University of Austin. And is really facing that challenge because legal education is kind of it's a discipline to learn. Of course, you can go off and do a lot of things with it. But that question about do a lot of things with it is, what do you do? What are you going to do with your life? Really, how do you want to design your engagement socially, commercially, professionally, so that you have the experience of a life well lived? And sort of the shorthand I use for it is that a life well lived contributes to the well-being of others. Contributes to the well-being of others. Now, you can do that as a banker, you can do that in real estate, you can do that in medicine, you can do that in education, you can do it in any area. But what is your purpose? What's your intent going in there? Is it to create fame? Is it to create reputation? Is it to make a lot of money? Nothing's wrong with those. But if the underlying intent really is to contribute to the well-being of other people, then you're going to find yourself designing truly a very fulfilling life.
Oh, that's great. We have another question. One of our board members actually would like to know, do you have any friends that you've made during study abroad that have been particularly important in your later life today?
Oh, my goodness. Yes. Thank you for the question. So there I am in London. I'm in the basement of the YMCA. We had a little kitchen for the students' use. We're all studying for our exams, and I'm nodding off, falling asleep, right? And there's a guy who was in the program. He was the only Black student from the United States who was in the program. And his name at the time was Terrence Young. And we call him T. And he looked at me and said, the reason you're falling asleep is because of what you eat. I said, what are you talking about? And he was a vegetarian. He turned out to make his entire life in health foods. And he said, try being vegetarian for a week. I was a kid, I'd try anything, right? So for 1 week during exams, I went pure vegetarian, and my energy, which is already a little bit high, as you can tell, skyrocketed. And that led to decades of being a vegetarian. Now that fellow, was just incredibly influential. We were good friends. I saw him again when he was in Vienna. He went to IES in Vienna after his semester in London, and, visited him there. And then somehow we lost touch. And 30 years went by before I was able to find him again. And just 2 years ago, he and I reconnected. And we saw each other, like, my brother, right back there with that kind of sense of connection. So to answer your question, absolutely yes. There have been a couple of other good friends that I made, my roommate, who's since passed on, unfortunately, early, but we stayed in touch, and some others in the program as well.
Oh, that's great. So was your friend who helped you sort of learn that vegetarian was a good fit for you? Did he know what you had been doing all these years?
No.
He hadn't seen you. That's interesting.
We lost touch.
Okay.
And it was funny when we came back, and he said, oh yeah, I spent my entire life in health food logistics. I said, okay, that makes sense, right? And I said, I spent my entire life uplifting the world, creating service, organizing events, workshops. He goes, yep, that's my man. Because he knew me also as the guy who was organizing Frisbee tournaments in Hyde Park. And roping in all the students so we had enough people to make a team.
That's super. We have another friend who would like to know what your design in Singapore ultimately looked like, your garden.
Ooh, that's a great question. Because there's a street that goes around and all of the plots are quite small, you get street noise. And I'm somebody who's very acoustically sensitive. Like right now, I'm literally in a soundproof room that we built into our house, like a home studio environment. In fact, I'll just take a moment here and say hello. This is, no, not that one. I'm just going to switch camera. Right. So yeah, this is where I am. Hello. Right. I mean, it literally is a Zoom enabled, purpose-built environment for this current world. So what I want to do is, rather than have a house and an outside lawn, create the house so that it captures a courtyard. And courtyards are very common in the Middle East. They're very common in various European cities. They're not very common in Singapore. Interesting design challenge. Right. Then if you're going to create a space to age in place, you want to bring all of the aging construction issues into the interior design. So you're not going to have steps, maybe ramps, an elevator. You have to build those doors that are a little bit wider. The way you open up doors and drawers has to be done in a certain way. And a lot of that exists, but that's not common in the residential home building industry. It's common in nursing homes. I don't want it to feel like a nursing home. I want it to be home. But then also I enjoy convening people. So I'd like to make sure we create it in a way. My wife loves to cook. She's a fabulous cook, where you can have 2 people, 6 people, 16 people, 26 people. And how do you design for that? Oh, and it might be raining. So, you can already kind of imagine the challenges that we're posing to the students: capture rainwater, be solar efficient, energy, et cetera, et cetera.
Oh, that's great. So is it in progress still, or is it nearing completion, or?
There's a design brief that I've put together that's about 14 pages, a section on acoustics and a section on recycling and a section on building materials for easy maintenance, and, all of that. And those interdisciplinary projects are just getting started. Because it's students that are going to be doing these design ideas, my wife likes to say, just because they design it doesn't mean we have to build it. And we're sure that there's going to be a lot of creative ideation. That's the whole idea. And I figure we're looking at about 3 years of design and then a couple of years to build. And whoever asked the question, you are welcome to come and knock on the door.
I think we'd all like to just knock on the door.
Come on over.
Project. It's a great
We'll
project.
feed you.
Let's see, we have another question. Ron, your remarkable creativity and enthusiasm are inspirational. What do you attribute these traits to? Were they learned intentionally, or were they always a part of who you are?
When I was a kid, my nickname was Rambunctious Ron. There's sort of this, fountain-esque kind of energy. But at the same time, I was truly, truly blessed because there were 3 major educators in my life and an engineer. So my grandfather was actually, the YMCA? Well, he ran the YMHA. So it was the Jewish version of the YMCA in not a great neighborhood in New York. And his job was to keep kids off the streets and out of jail. And that meant you need to get them in school or in a job. And so that kind of like, you better do something good with your life. That was Grandpa. Grandma, his wife, my father's mother, taught kindergarten for 40 years in New York City. In her last year of teaching, she had the grandson of somebody who had been her kindergartner when she started her career. Amazing. She was nominated and awarded as one of the best teachers in New York, but they only had one child, my dad. So every weekend she would come out of New York into Connecticut where we lived, and it was like private kindergarten time with the kindergarten teacher. So I had all of that encouragement to play and learn. And then my mom taught high school for 20 years. Now that's not easy when your mother teaches at your high school. But that whole educational impulse has been there. And the engineer is my dad. And he's a consulting engineer, or he was during his professional career. And so he's the guy who said, what's the problem? Let's figure this out. Let's come up with a new idea. And because he was a solo consultant, he was the guy that literally got hired because he could think differently, because he could look at what the in-house research lab at major organizations couldn't figure out for themselves. So they had to bring in the consultant. And his office was in the basement next to my bedroom. And so, I kind of learned all of that, helped cook the rambunctiousness into an enthusiasm to contribute.
Oh, that's great. So do you think the study abroad served to heighten those qualities or kind of further them?
Absolutely, massively, because what they couldn't give me was the diversity of the world. They couldn't show me the range of cultural practices and the religious history and the way in which history itself, I was a history major, influenced the evolution of societies and governments and educational systems and healthcare and social expectations and personal expectations and possibilities. And so, I always say the amount of privilege of being born in the post-Second World War generation as a white English-speaking American male in a middle-class family where I could go to a college and study overseas. When you're given that amount of privilege, what is your responsibility to give back? It's 198%. And so go live your life, but live your life in a way that really honors what life's given you so you can contribute to other people.
Oh, that's great. So I have a question for you, actually. So post-COVID, people have really, the past few years, people have really had some challenging times, and they're coming to the world and the people around them with different perspectives, a different frame of mind. Some are harboring some, anger or disappointment or whatever it may be that are not necessarily positive. How are you helping organizations and people in client service be able to still do their job well and achieve great performance in this new environment?
That was your question, Jody?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for asking.
You're welcome.
So the phenomenon of service is something that after 3 decades, I have a reputation, but I also know what I'm talking about. So whether it's customer service, internal service, B2B, B2C, doesn't matter. But underlying the phenomenon of service is another human phenomenon, which is that of care. And care at the present moment is as unclearly articulated as service was 30 years ago. Now, this whole field of customer experience, customer loyalty, customer service has evolved in 3 decades, and I've had the privilege of being part of it. But this phenomenon of taking good care or being a leader who cares it's an equivalent stage right now of where it was. If you say to most people, even the word care, they think of healthcare. Or the philosophers in academic environments say, oh, it's a very complex subject, very difficult to define. That's not very helpful when we have people, like you mentioned, coming out of a COVIDian era where we're going, hold on, how do I take care of my own well-being? Right. So I've started studying it, working on it, because I can take abstractions like service and literally turn them into a curriculum that make it easy to understand and apply. So I've done that with care, and I call it careology. I was actually stunned to realize that the word didn't exist except for a skincare lotion. And now there's a cancer management app out of the UK called Careology. Well, I trademarked the word for education, for workshops, for books and instructional materials, and are now developing that, and it'll be coming out as my next book in a couple of years' time. So this whole idea of leaders who care. But to get to the nub of your question, it's the distinction between wellness and well-being. Okay, people are coming out with a lot of issues. Wellness, you can't have wellness unless you also have sickness. I mean, it's on a spectrum of how well where are you in terms of health? But when you say well-being, it begs the question, what is being human? And which component of your being is out of kilter? In which area of your life as a human being could you take better care? And that requires, authentic, genuine thinking. Like it could be in terms of your family. It could be in terms of your body. It could be in terms of your relationship with your community, at work, in the neighborhood, with your friends, with your faith, with your sports. It could be in your sense of your mortality and what are you doing with your life? So, it's not something to just take casually like, oh, I really want to be more happy. It genuinely deserves the level of investigation and work and study and application, because we are human and we are therefore very diverse, which means there's a lot of opportunity to improve.
So I imagine there's a balance of careology and
Service.
And service, and moving an initiative or a mission forward to be able to create that culture. Would that be?
Well, think about it. Service is care in action. Like when you say to somebody, take good care, what you mean is don't just think about it. You mean actually do something for yourself. Take action to create value for your own well-being. Or take good care of mom. Take action to create value for mom, for her well-being. So that's service and care are directly connected to each other.
Okay. That's great. I can't wait to. So I imagine there's another book coming, Careology or of the sort, that will be in there. Okay, great. Let's see. What determined your desire to work as an individual versus working for a more established company?
Good question. When I mentioned about going overseas and therefore seeing the consequence of history and how it affects people's lives and who we become. If you're born French, you become French. If you're born Chinese, you're Chinese. Keith is on this call, our engineer tech support. He comes from a Taiwanese background. And so there's something about being that. In my case, my father was the electro-optical engineer. And so he was the solo consultant with no employees who never worked for a large organization except very shortly after college. And even then it was small. So I kind of grew up with that, what do you do? All 5 children that my parents had all went off and ended up doing our own thing. None of us ever ended up working for the man, I worked for some big companies a little bit right after college, but, consultant. Now, am I happy about that? Yeah, because I've intellectually learned to be able to navigate just about any corporate industrial field of life. Can really listen like a consultant, discern the distinctions, which somebody who's embedded in one of those sometimes becomes, it's so familiar to them, they can't see outside. They can't bring creative thinking to it, okay? That's the upside. The downside is I never really learned how to coordinate, orchestrate, develop much larger initiatives. And one of the things that I've said to my daughter several times when I was accepting and encouraging her in her own interest to study law was that if I had studied contracts as a young person, I think my impact in the world would have been even more significant, because I would have understood, how do you structure? How do you actually put together groups and teams of people in a way that you can manifest at a much larger scale than as an individual contributor?
Oh, that's super interesting. What a great lesson to pass on to your daughter as well. So we have a question for Greg. Greg, creating global leaders today is a challenge. What is IES doing for today's students as they return to study abroad?
Wow. Well, the first thing we're trying to do is get them out of their parents' basements, which is, probably the first thing that we've learned from kind of the COVID era. That we've in some ways, one of the great things about study abroad is just getting them out there and exposed to a world that is of which they're somewhat familiar, but for which they really don't have any great experience. And I think that's it's those type of experiences that they gain along that way that I think really helps develop their ability to perceive challenges, how to adjust to challenges, how to figure out. And perhaps some of the points that Ron brings in are important here, particularly how to think about doing the right thing, rather than just doing things right. How do you kind of develop that kind of inner compass, and a lot of it is just putting them and just taking their lives, shaking it up, and putting them in a different environment where they have to relearn how to get to class. It's not just 3 blocks away. No, you're going to have to take public transportation. You're going to have to get deeply exposed to just a different culture. And I think that developing those kinds of skills of understanding, I think, are probably some of the key ingredients that I certainly got when I was studying abroad. Meeting with people who were greatly different than I was, and trying to find common elements and common threads that connect us, I think, are some things we do. So in short, if I were to kind of summarize it, probably just giving them those experiences, sometimes easy, sometimes quite confrontational, that make them think about what are the things that are meaningful in their life, and in some ways kind of builds out that reflective nature of what they do. I know, as a college experience, sometimes I used to call it, the 3 R's that we're really trying to do, and it's really accelerated in the study abroad world. One is, you're trying to build responsibility in them. How do I take responsibility for the things I do? How do I build resilience? Because study abroad will knock you down sometimes. You will be stuck and miss the last bus and be in a place that you kind of have to figure out. And finally, the 3rd R is always reflection. There are a lot of things that keep you busy at study abroad, but there's also a big chance to step back and think of the world in important ways. So I don't know, as an academic, sometimes I always get the answer at the end of the question, rather than the beginning of the question. Ron's good at the beginning of the question. That's how thinking
works. Yeah, that's how thinking works, right?
Yeah. I tend to get there at the end, not at the beginning, but maybe it was called the 3 M's: responsibility, resilience, and reflection. That's what it does. There you go. There's the answer.
Can I piggyback on that, Jody?
Yeah,
yes, please.
You'll do a much better job than me.
No, Greg, that was great, especially what you said right at the end, because we grow up in this world like, so what do you think? And the moment you open your mouth, you're supposed to have a smart answer. When the reality is, because we live in language, we invent life and the future in this creative dialogue with one another. We don't know what we think until we start speaking. And then here it comes. And so, Gregory, if you're one of those, like I am as well, my team knows, let Ron talk, but only really pay attention in the last 20%. Because the first 80%, he's thinking, he's exploring, that's what we were going for. And that kind of freedom comes from stepping back from the expectation that you should know what you're up to right away. By putting somebody in a different culture, you've already unhinged them from that expectation. There's no way to know, right? And so there's a lot of freedom. And I would say to anybody on this call who has now gotten older and is a parent, that it is especially important that you think about your children and what you can do to give them the world, give them that expanding experience. Ideally, it would be an overseas program, but even if not, then something in another neighborhood, in another city, in another part of the country where you live.
I expect, Ron, that you're going to love this next question. I certainly do. Ron, are you going to set up some kind of service academy for students, graduates, and young professionals who would like to dive in to careology?
Thank you. The answer, of course, is yes. I figure at my age, I still have 2 to 3 more decades to go, which is quite intriguing because if I think, wait a minute, let me go backwards 3 decades. 3 decades ago, I was a kid. I just arrived in Singapore for the first week. And look at what's happened. Oh, add another 3 decades. What are you going to be up to? My goodness gracious. So COVID had a hidden blessing. Working from home took me off the planes. I mean, Jody, I was doing 100 airplane flights every year for 29 years. And while that's exciting and dynamic and very successful, it didn't allow for a lot of really deep, I mean, I got a lot done. But what I look at now, look what we're doing on Zoom. Look at how many people around the world we can reach. So online learning has changed the game. And the ability to record here in the studio and to develop good instructional materials and use this talent as a presenter, but then take responsibility for organizing it in a way that people can learn about it and actually apply it. I look forward to that. We're doing that now with service, and it will come also with care.
I think that's great. It's hard to activate people online, though, don't you think? Because it's your learning is active, as you said. That's not hard. Okay, so what's your secret with that?
Not hard. Well, the challenge is this, that it's kind of like, you know, when technology came and it was introduced to all of us by the technologists and it looked hard, right? But now you've got Apple and they don't even give you an instruction manual. You just get the thing and start figuring it out and ask your friend and go online. And, you know, it's so intuitive. So when online learning came up, it was more like, now what am I supposed to do? Okay, you know, here's my PowerPoint slide and I'm going to read it to you. And, you know, and of course, email is one click away. And so how do you keep people's attention? And so that aspect of being engaging and entertaining to some extent, I developed it on the stage. I could be there with a microphone and 1,000 people and a lot of room to move. Well, here, the room to move is this big. But whoever is doing the teaching has the responsibility to make this engaging. And some of that is being an engaging presenter, but also if we were to design, for example, a 6-hour workshop online, we would use breakouts. We would have pre-assignments and posts. We'd be doing things in terms of panels. We'd be having various people do presentations. So the design of the educational experience can still be done in a way that's very engaging. And that's a challenge for everyone.
We have someone regarding the value of international experience. When I worked for IBM out of university, I expressed interest in working internationally 40 years ago. And a lot of people questioned my sanity and said how difficult it is to repatriate back to the United States and IBM. At that time, Fortune 500 companies' global revenue were 80% domestic, 20% international. And now it is literally reversed. Let's see. I did end up living and working in Hong Kong and London with my family, and I'm now involved in the international commercial real estate business, which is great, which actually leads to a good question. A lot of our students, when they come back, they do want to be able to return abroad and they do want to be able to create international careers. How were you able to do that? Do you have any advice for them?
Well, first, I would say that the real culture shock is when you come back. I remember, you know, going overseas and, you know, you get immersed and it's one, then you come back to the life that, you know, and all the other students and you're like, oh, what's going on here? That's a challenging adjustment. And I just want to address that issue about, are you crazy? You're going to destroy your career by going overseas. And, you know, in some cultures, it doesn't destroy the career, but it changes the life. For example, if you're Japanese and you work for a major multinational, Sony or one of the others, and you go overseas and you stay overseas in one of the global positions for a certain period of time, it's pretty well understood you're never going to come back and work in Tokyo. And it's not just that you won't fit in, it's the rest of us won't really accept you fitting in. And so you get this entire global community of Japanese expatriates who have accepted that they want that style of life. And it sounds like the person who asked that question chose that style of life. They lived in Hong Kong, they lived in London, they're in international real estate. So I don't quite know what the specific question is, except to say that getting an international experience opens a world for the rest of your life. And I would encourage in today's world, given everything that's happening, that could be one of the most important things that any young person experiences. Getting out into the world, getting outside of your own cultural boundaries in whatever manner you're able, and not just as a tourist who stays with everybody else from your same country and goes off and drinks and has a good time and then says, oh, I visited that country. There are people who do that, and there's nothing wrong with it as a holiday vacation, but it's not the same as a cultural immersion.
Right, that's true.
I was going to say that was fantastic advice you gave earlier about how hard it is, not just the culture shock of studying abroad, but how hard it is to return from study abroad. In fact, my advisor, when I studied abroad, gave me two great pieces of advice that I have. That was one of them. The second one, and this was, of course, living in London, which is April showers brings May showers. So that was the other one. He said, it's just going to rain and just get used to it. So that was the two big pieces I remember from my advisor. I had plenty of other great academic experiences, but my advisor was a bit of a character.
That's great. Well, it looks like we do not have any more questions. Anyone want to dash one in really quickly? If not, we've had a great discussion. And it looks like people are happy with that. So I'd like to say thank you, Ron, and thank you, Greg, very much for your time and your expertise and your energy today. And I wanted to thank everyone who's joined us in this event for their time and for your interest and your wonderful questions. You've really added so much to what we had put together. And I want to close with saying, referring back to Ron's idea of careology and giving back and the environment. And I have to say that that is a good part of what my work is and Jennifer's work is at IES Abroad, as well as Greg, and that is giving back and being of help to bring other students abroad through scholarships, and then also be able to teach them really wonderful lessons and expertise to then be global citizens and give back to the world, such as our new Sustainable Cities Design course, which is enabling students to be able to learn about environmental issues and empowering them to think of new ideas to address these issues. So we have many wonderful initiatives going at IES Abroad. And for those of us who are lucky to be able to study abroad, it's great to be able to give back and allow others to have that same wonderful experience. So I'm entering right now into our chat a link to be able to donate to any of our initiatives that we have here at IES Abroad. If you're interested, we would love to have you join us in our work and give back to the world and our future global citizens.